Two tiny shepherd puppies sat beside an open crate in a snow-covered alley, pressed so close together they looked like one trembling shadow. A Navy SEAL named Caleb Brooks saw them once, then kept walking. But the next day, they were still there. And the day after that, still waiting beside the same crate, with a small green key tied to the handle. The key was marked Unit 4B. But Unit 4B had been locked for months. Why were the puppies left there? Who tied that key to their crate? And why did one of them start barking at 2:13 in the morning, outside the door of the woman who wanted them gone? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late winter morning settled over Erie, Pennsylvania, with a kind of cold that did not shout. It simply waited in the bricks, in the alley stones, in the iron railings behind old apartment buildings, then slipped through coat seams like a patient thief. Snow from the night before had hardened into a thin, white crust along the service lane behind Harbor Row, a long, aging brick apartment building 3 blocks from the lake. The wind carried the faint smell of frozen water, diesel smoke, and old garbage bins that had been dragged out too early. Above a narrow side door, a faded red emergency exit sign pointed down toward the alley, its arrow bright against the weathered wall, as if some forgotten hand had painted it there to accuse everyone who passed. Caleb Brooks noticed the arrow before he noticed the puppies. He was 43, a Navy SEAL on extended leave, built broad through the shoulders and lean through the waist, with short, dark brown hair brushed back from a square forehead, a neatly trimmed beard touched with gray near the chin, and eyes that seemed trained to measure exits before faces. People at Harbor Row knew him as the quiet man in 3C, the one who came and went with military posture, carried his groceries in one trip and never stayed long enough in the lobby for gossip to catch him. Caleb was not rude exactly. He held doors, he nodded, he paid rent early. But he had the manner of a locked room, clean, orderly, and not meant to be entered. Years in uniform had taught him how to move toward danger. The year after had taught him how to avoid needing anyone once the danger was gone. He had taken the alley that morning because the front steps were glazed with ice, and because he preferred routes where no one asked how he was doing. His boots crunched over the snow. The green dumpster stood against the wall, lid half open, surrounded by scattered coffee cups and a torn cardboard box. Beside it sat a gray plastic pet crate with its wire door hanging open. At first, Caleb thought it was empty. Then something inside the shadow of the crate shifted, and 2 small faces turned toward him. They were German shepherd puppies, no more than 6 or 7 weeks old, pressed so tightly together that their black and tan fur blended into one trembling shape. Snowflakes clung to their soft ears and tiny whiskers. One puppy was slightly smaller with a narrow face, damp paws, and a left ear folded sideways like a question it was too young to ask. The other was broader through the chest, with a dark mask around both eyes, and an expression that tried very hard to be fierce, though its whole body shook from the cold. The bigger puppy let out a hoarse little sound, not quite a bark, more like a warning borrowed from an older dog. The smaller one buried its nose against the crate blanket and stared at Caleb as if silence were the only defense it had left. Caleb stopped. His first thought was practical, animal control. His second was colder. Not my problem. That thought arrived so quickly it embarrassed him. He looked up and down the alley. No owner, no fresh footprints except his own and the tire marks from the trash truck. The crate had a gray towel inside, stiff with frozen dampness. A few pieces of kibble were scattered near the door, already crusted with snow. Someone had not simply lost these puppies. Someone had placed them here, arranged just enough comfort to make leaving feel less cruel, then walked away before the living part of the decision could look back. The bigger puppy made that rough little sound again. Caleb tightened his jaw. Easy, he muttered, though he did not step closer. He had heard fear in many forms: shouted orders, broken radio calls, silence after bad news. This was smaller, but it had the same root. A creature had learned, far too early, that the world could open a door and still abandon you beside it. Caleb reached for his phone, found the number for Erie Animal Services, then paused when the call went to an automated message about weather delays and high call volume. He left the location, his name, and the words, 2 shepherd puppies behind Harbor Row. Then he put the phone away and stood there a moment longer than he meant to. From the second-floor window above the service door, Eleanor Price watched him without moving the curtain much. Eleanor was 68, tall and narrow, with silver hair pinned into a hard coil at the back of her head, pale skin that winter made almost translucent, and a face built around discipline more than softness. She had been the building manager at Harbor Row for 11 years, and before that, a bookkeeper for a shipping office where men twice her size learned quickly not to bring her sloppy paperwork. Since her husband Harold's death 6 years earlier, Eleanor had become even more exacting. Grief had not made her tender. It had made her efficient. She believed in notices, records, proper exits, salt on icy sidewalks, and rules followed before they became disasters. Lately, however, even rules had begun to feel thin. The owner of Harbor Row had been speaking with developers from Cleveland, men with glossy shoes and smiles that never reached their eyes. One complaint, one insurance issue, one report of unauthorized animals, and the long-time tenants might be painted as liabilities instead of people. Eleanor saw the crate. She saw the puppies. She saw Caleb standing there like a man arguing with himself. Her hand moved toward the phone on the windowsill, then stopped. She had already called once about stray animals in the alley weeks before, and been told every shelter was full. She had already received 3 letters from the owner about keeping the property market-ready. Compassion was simple in church bulletins and greeting cards. In an old building with unpaid repairs and rich men circling like winter crows, compassion came with paperwork. Eleanor let the curtain fall back into place. A little while later, she hated herself for doing it. Not enough to go downstairs, not yet. Caleb went to work. He told himself he had done the reasonable thing. He had reported the puppies. Someone would come. By evening, the alley was empty of people, but not of dogs. The 2 puppies were still there. The bigger one had moved half inside the crate, half outside, as if trying to guard both the blanket and the smaller pup. Caleb set down a cup of water and a small paper tray of chicken he had bought from a diner, but could not bring himself to eat. He placed them several feet away and backed off. The puppies did not move until he turned the corner. The next morning, they were still there. The water was gone. The chicken was gone. The crate remained open beneath the red arrow. Caleb stood in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets, feeling something old and unwelcome shift under his ribs. By the 3rd morning, the smaller puppy lifted its head when he arrived. It did not wag its tail. It did not crawl toward him. It simply looked at him, steady and exhausted, as if waiting to see whether he would become another set of footsteps fading down the alley. Caleb crouched then, not too close, just close enough to see the handle of the crate. A thin blue cord had been tied around it, stiff with ice. Hanging from the cord was a small green key, the paint chipped along one edge. Caleb frowned and brushed snow from the metal tag attached to it. 2 words had been scratched into the surface in uneven letters. Unit 4, B. His breath slowed. Harbor Row's Unit 4B had been sealed for months. The next morning came pale and brittle, with lake wind scraping along the backs of the buildings and lifting loose snow into little white spirals behind Harbor Row. Caleb Brooks returned to the alley before work with a paper bag tucked beneath one arm and the green key still turning over in his mind. Unit 4B. 2 small words scratched into metal, somehow heavier than the cold. He had checked the directory in the lobby on his way out. The slot for 4B was blank, covered by a strip of yellowed tape. No name, no forwarding address, no explanation. Harbor Row had plenty of blank things. Blank windows, blank faces, blank notices taped over old promises. Caleb preferred blank things. They did not ask questions. But the puppies were not blank. They were waiting in the same place, pressed against the gray crate like 2 little embers refusing to go out. He stopped several yards away and crouched, keeping his body turned slightly aside so he would not look like a threat. That was something he knew without needing a manual. Fear did not like being stared at. The smaller puppy had tucked itself deep into the towel, only its dark eyes visible above the stiff edge of fabric. Its black and tan coat looked damp near the belly, and bits of frozen slush clung to its paws. The larger puppy stood in front of it with wobbly determination, its oversized paws planted wide, its little muzzle wrinkled in a growl that came out more like a cracked cough. Caleb almost smiled. The creature was no bigger than a winter boot, and already carrying the burden of a castle guard. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "I see you." He opened the bag and set down a shallow container of soft food and another of water. The smell reached the puppies at once. The smaller one leaned forward, then froze. The larger one took 2 careful steps, stopped, looked at Caleb, then backed into the crate again. Caleb understood that argument better than he wanted to. Hunger said move, memory said don't. He stood slowly and walked to the end of the alley, turning his back without leaving completely. Behind him came the faint scrape of paws on icy concrete. He did not look over his shoulder. Some acts of mercy had to pretend not to be watching. By midday, Caleb had called Erie Animal Services again. This time he reached a dispatcher named Rosie Delgado, a woman with a warm, tired voice and the brisk patience of someone who had answered too many emergencies with too few trucks. Rosie sounded middle-aged, practical, and kind in a way that had been rubbed thin by winter. She explained that the city had more cold-weather calls than usual, that foster homes were full, that officers were prioritizing injured animals and active danger. Caleb gave the address, described the crate, the puppies, the key. Rosie sighed softly when he mentioned their age. 6 or 7 weeks, you think? She asked. Maybe, Caleb said. They're small. Small goes downhill fast in this weather, Rosie replied. Food helps, but cold takes what food can't replace. That sentence followed him through the rest of the afternoon. It sat beside him in the maintenance truck while he inspected frozen gutters near the east stairwell. It leaned over his shoulder while he tightened a loose handrail on the second-floor landing. It waited inside his chest while he passed residents who knew him only as a quiet shape in a dark jacket. He had spent years making decisions under pressure, yet now he was irritated by 2 puppies because they offered no clear order, no mission brief, no authority to blame if he chose wrong. A man could face storms, gunfire, deep water, and still be undone by a sound so small it barely counted as a sound at all. That afternoon, the sound came through the alley door while Eleanor Price stood in the lobby holding a clipboard. She had been checking salt levels in the entryway, her sharp black shoes planted neatly apart, her silver hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull every expression into discipline. Near the mailboxes, Mr. Walter Dorsey from 2A was fumbling with a stack of envelopes. He was 81, short and round-shouldered, with soft brown skin, watery eyes, and a gray cardigan buttoned wrong by one hole. A retired bus driver, he greeted everyone as if the whole building were still climbing aboard his route. That morning, even Walter sounded uneasy. "Miss Price," he said, leaning toward the alley door, "that crying out there. Sounds like babies." Eleanor's lips tightened. They are not babies, Mr. Dorsey. No, he said gently. But they don't know that. The sentence landed too softly to defend against. Eleanor told him she had already made a call. She did not mention that she had also received another email from the owner's office that morning, reminding her that visible disorder could affect the pending evaluation. Visible disorder. That was what the world called need when it wanted permission to step around it. She signed the SALT checklist with more force than necessary and went through the service door. The cold slapped her cheeks at once. Eleanor walked halfway down the alley and stopped. The puppies were still by the crate. The larger one turned toward her and gave that broken little warning sound. The smaller one shivered so hard the towel moved around it. Eleanor's face changed before she could stop it. For one breath, she looked not like a manager, not like a widow, not like a woman built out of rules, but like someone who remembered holding something fragile and losing anyway. Then the expression closed. She pulled her coat tighter, took out her phone, and called the animal service number again. She gave her name, the address, the details, every word clipped and correct. When the dispatcher told her there might be a delay, Eleanor said, "Of course," in a voice that meant nothing was of course. Caleb saw her from the far end of the alley when he returned near dusk. For a moment, they faced each other across the narrow strip of snow, two people who had both done something and not enough. Eleanor lifted her chin. "I reported them," she said. "So did I." "Then there is a process." Caleb looked past her at the crate. "Processes don't get cold." Her eyes sharpened. "And unmanaged situations become liabilities." He almost laughed, but there was no humor in him. "They're puppies. Everything is simple when you don't have to answer for it," Eleanor said. And the words were harder because they carried truth as well as fear. She left first. Caleb stayed. He placed more food near the wall, poured water that steamed faintly in the cold, and waited long enough to see the larger puppy creep forward after he moved away. It ate first, quick and nervous, then backed aside so the smaller one could reach the tray. That small courtesy hurt more than it should have. Even half frozen, even abandoned, the little guard still made room for the one behind it. By night, snow began falling again, thicker than before, soft at first, then steady. Caleb lay awake in his apartment in 3C, staring at the ceiling while the radiator ticked and the wind pressed against the windows. He told himself the puppies had food. He told himself 2 calls had been made. He told himself that responsible adults trusted systems, and that a man who brought every broken thing home would eventually become a shelter with a pulse. Sometime before dawn, a thin whimper rose in his memory. It may not have come from outside at all. It may have been only guilt learning how to make a sound. Caleb turned onto his side, then onto his back again. The room around him was clean, sparse, obedient. Boots by the door, jacket over the chair, keys on the counter, no photographs on the walls. Nothing in the apartment needed him. Nothing asked him to stay. At 4 a.m, he sat up. For a long moment he remained still, as if waiting for the sensible part of himself to issue a final objection. It did not. Caleb stood, pulled on his coat, took an old fleece blanket from the closet, and grabbed the small transport crate he had bought years earlier for a dog he had never allowed himself to adopt. At the door, he paused and looked back at the silent apartment. "Temporary," he muttered. The room gave no answer. It did not need to. It knew a lie when it heard one. Before sunrise, the alley behind Harbor Row looked less like a place built by people and more like a narrow cut in the winter itself. Snow had fallen thickly through the last dark hours, softening the edges of the dumpsters, burying old footprints, and turning the red emergency arrow on the brick wall into the only bright thing in sight. Caleb Brooks stood at the mouth of the alley with the transport crate in one hand and the fleece blanket tucked beneath his arm, feeling foolish in a way he could not quite name. He had worn uniforms into places where men did not speak above a whisper. He had crossed water in darkness and learned to listen for dangers most people never imagined. Yet now, he stood motionless because two German Shepherd puppies, each small enough to fit against his ribs, had looked at him as if trust were a trap. The original gray crate was still beside the wall, half dusted with snow. The larger puppy stood just outside it. Black and tan fur puffed against the cold, paws planted wide, head lowered in that brave, ridiculous pose that would have been funny if the situation had not been so bitter. The smaller puppy was curled in the stiff towel, shaking less than before but looking too quiet for Caleb's comfort. Caleb set his new crate down several yards away. He did not reach, he did not call. He only unfolded the fleece blanket and laid it across the snow between the old crate and the new one, making a narrow path of blue fabric over white ice. Then, after a moment, he removed his own work jacket and placed it beside the blanket, closer to the puppies. The jacket carried his scent now: coffee, cold air, metal tools, and the faint soap he used because it came in plain packaging and asked nothing of him. "Not a negotiation," he said softly. "More like a suggestion." The larger puppy stared at him. The smaller one blinked from the towel. Caleb backed away and sat on an overturned milk crate near the opposite wall. The cold came up through his boots. Minutes passed. The city began waking beyond the alley, a truck reversing somewhere, a distant engine struggling in the cold, a door shutting hard against the wind. The puppies did not move. Caleb forced his hands to remain still. The old part of him wanted action, a clean solution, the satisfying click of a completed task. But nothing living had ever truly healed on command. He knew that. He hated that he knew it. Nearly an hour passed before the larger puppy took one step onto the jacket. Its paw sank into the fabric. It looked offended by the softness, then suspicious of it, then faintly interested. Caleb lowered his eyes, pretending to study the snow near his boots. Another step came. Then another. The smaller puppy lifted its head, watching its brave little guard test the world inch by inch. The larger puppy reached the edge of the fleece blanket and sniffed the opening of the new crate. Caleb had placed warm food inside, just beyond the door. The puppy's nose twitched. Hunger reached farther than courage at first. It stepped in halfway, then backed out so quickly its rear paws slid on the snow. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he did not move. "Take your time," he whispered, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to the puppy or to himself. Inside Harbor Row, Eleanor Price watched from the service door window, her gloved hand resting on the metal push bar. Her coat was buttoned perfectly, but a strand of silver hair had slipped loose from its coil, making her look older and more human than she preferred. She had come downstairs intending to inspect the alley, perhaps to remind Caleb that unauthorized animals created complications. Instead, she stood silent, seeing a man built for force choose stillness. It unsettled her. Stillness had never been her method. After Harold died, she had survived by making lists. Cancel the hospital bed, return the unused medication, notify the pension office, change the locks, keep moving. She had never trusted anything that required waiting. Waiting gave grief time to sit down beside you. The larger puppy finally entered the crate. It turned once inside, still watching Caleb with dark, solemn suspicion. The smaller puppy did not follow. It remained in the old towel, trembling now, the distance between the two crates suddenly wider than the alley itself. Caleb leaned forward an inch, then stopped. The larger puppy gave a thin whine from inside the crate, not frightened this time, but calling. The smaller one shifted. Its folded ear twitched. It dragged one paw onto Caleb's jacket, then froze. Above them, a delivery truck rumbled down the street and struck a pothole hard enough to shake snow from the fire escape. The alley boomed with the sound. The smaller puppy panicked. It scrambled forward blindly, slipped, recovered, and darted straight into the new crate beside the larger one. Caleb closed the door with both hands, gently, as if he were not locking them in but holding the winter out. For a second, he kept his fingers on the wire. The two puppies huddled together inside, breathing fast. "That's it," he said. His voice came out rough. "That's enough for today." The clinic on Peach Street opened early for weather emergencies. Dr. Laura Benton met him at the side entrance, the compact woman in her early 50s with warm brown skin, short black hair threaded with gray, and the direct, steady eyes of someone who had seen both cruelty and devotion arrive in cardboard boxes. She wore purple scrubs under a heavy cardigan and moved with practical kindness, never cooing too loudly, never making the puppies feel surrounded. Her assistant, Miles Carter, a tall young man with reddish curls and a nervous smile, carried towels from the warmer and spoke in a whisper as though the whole clinic were a church. The examination took less than an hour. No microchips, no matched missing reports. Mild dehydration, low body temperature but improving. Empty bellies, stress. No broken bones, no obvious injuries. "They were lucky," Dr. Benton said, though her mouth tightened as she glanced at the crate. "Or almost lucky." Caleb looked down at the green key in his palm. He had removed it from the old crate handle before leaving the alley. "This was tied to them," he said. Dr. Benton turned it over once. "Unit 4B, she read. "That means something?" Caleb put it back into his pocket. "Not yet." In the parking lot, while the puppies slept under warmed towels, Caleb called his younger brother. Mark Brooks answered on the fourth ring, his voice bright with surprise he tried to hide. Mark was 39, a high school history teacher in Erie, tall and softer-bodied than Caleb, with sandy brown hair that never stayed combed, kind gray eyes, and a beard he kept because his students said it made him look less like a substitute. Mark had their mother's gentleness and their father's stubbornness, a combination Caleb had once dismissed as weakness. After their father died, they had argued over everything: the house, the funeral, the care bills, the things said in exhaustion that neither man had been brave enough to unsay. "You okay?" Mark asked. "I found 2 puppies." There was a pause. "That is not the sentence I expected." Caleb explained only the necessary parts. Mark offered to come by after school, bring supplies, help make calls. Caleb refused before Mark finished. "I've got it handled." Mark was quiet for a breath. "You always say that right before you build a wall and call it a plan." Caleb looked toward the clinic door, his reflection faint in the glass. "Not today, Mark." His brother sighed. Not angry, just tired of knocking on the same closed door. "All right. But if the wall needs a door, call me." By late afternoon, Caleb carried the crate into apartment 3C. The room seemed to hold its breath. He set the puppies near the laundry area, spread the fleece blanket inside the open crate, and placed food and water nearby. For a while, neither puppy moved. Then the smaller one sank into the blanket and slept, as if sleep had finally found permission. The larger one stepped out unsteadily, crossed the floor, and lowered its chin onto Caleb's old military boots by the door. Caleb stood over them, unable to look away. Then he turned his face toward the kitchen, as though someone had caught him becoming gentle. The first change in Caleb Brooks' apartment was not love. It was laundry. By the next morning, towels hung over the backs of chairs, a damp fleece blanket occupied the bathroom rod, and a line of tiny paw prints traveled from the laundry corner to the kitchen like evidence left by 2 very small criminals with no understanding of subtlety. The two German Shepherd puppies had survived the night inside apartment 3C, though inside seemed to confuse them. Benny, the smaller one, earned his temporary name because he rolled onto his back every time he fell asleep, round belly exposed, paws curled like a loaf of bread left too close to the oven. Scout, the larger one, earned his name honestly. He studied every corner, every door hinge, every shadow under furniture with the solemn suspicion of a night watchman who had been promoted far too young. Caleb kept telling himself the names meant nothing. People named temporary things all the time, he reasoned. Ships, storms, bad coffee machines. Still, when Benny sneezed into the water bowl and then looked personally betrayed by the splash, Caleb heard himself say, "Benny, that was your own fault," before he could stop the warmth from reaching his voice. He regretted it immediately, not because it was wrong, but because it sounded like belonging. By the second day, the apartment had surrendered further. A blue towel appeared beside the door for wet paws. A shallow water bowl sat against the kitchen wall. Caleb's old military boots had been moved 6 inches away from the entrance because Scout insisted on sleeping with his chin across them, as if guarding a border drawn in leather. Caleb bought puppy pads, cleaner, soft food, a chew toy shaped like a rubber bone, and a small rope toy he had not intended to buy. At the checkout, the cashier, a college-age girl with a silver nose ring and sleepy kindness in her eyes, smiled and said, "New puppy?" Caleb placed the items on the belt with the seriousness of a man purchasing medical equipment. "Temporary situation," he said. The girl glanced at the rope toy, the training treats, the little blanket printed with cartoon paws, and raised one eyebrow. "Sure," she said, with the mercy of youth pretending not to know better. Harbor Row did not change as quickly. The lobby still smelled of radiator heat, old carpet, and the lemon polish Eleanor Price used on the mail table every Friday. Eleanor moved through the building with a clipboard tucked beneath her arm and worry pressed between her shoulder blades. She had seen Caleb carry the crate through the side entrance. She had not stopped him. That decision had followed her all evening like an unpaid bill. Now, standing in the management office behind a half-closed door, she stared at the green key Caleb had shown her only briefly when he asked whether Unit 4B had ever belonged to someone with dogs. Eleanor had told him it was none of his concern. The answer had come too fast. Caleb had noticed. Unit 4B had belonged to Mrs. Ruth Whitman, a small 82-year-old widow with cloud-white hair, soft brown eyes, and hands permanently scented, in Eleanor's memory, of lavender lotion and dog biscuits. Ruth had been gentle in a scattered way, the sort of woman who apologized to furniture after bumping into it. In better years, she had worn blue cardigans, carried peppermint candies in her coat pocket, and spoke to every animal as if it were a visiting dignitary. But time had stolen small pieces of Ruth before anyone understood how much was missing. First, she forgot rent dates, then the stove, then the hallway. The final incident had been a fall near the back stairwell after she wandered out at midnight looking for Sadie, her adult female German shepherd with a sable coat and amber eyes. After that, Ruth's niece arranged a nursing facility in Ohio, and Unit 4B was sealed until the family could collect the remaining belongings. The dog had vanished before Eleanor could solve the matter neatly. There had been calls, forms, unanswered messages, then developers, inspections, insurance letters, and the 1,000 little emergencies an old building used to bury unfinished guilt. Eleanor opened the file drawer and removed the Harbor Row pet policy, though she already knew every line. Restricted breeds were listed plainly, German Shepherds among them. Insurance requirement. No exceptions without written authorization. The rule had existed long before Caleb Brooks arrived, but rules had a way of feeling personal once they were placed in a person's hand. Eleanor looked toward the frosted office window. Outside, snow slid from the awning in a soft collapse. Inside, the building's pipes clanked like old bones. She thought of Ruth's face when she had asked, If Sadie comes back, you'll let her in, won't you? Eleanor had said yes because it was easier than explaining policies to a frightened old woman. Now that yes had returned in the form of 2 puppies and a green key. By the 3rd afternoon, Scout barked once at the vacuum cleaner, then ran behind Caleb's legs when it roared back. Benny attacked the loose end of a dish towel and dragged it backward with such pride that Caleb laughed before remembering he was alone. The laugh startled both puppies. Scout stared at him. Benny sat on the towel as if claiming victory over a fallen kingdom. For 1 minute, the apartment did not feel like a place where silence came to live. It felt inhabited. Caleb stood in the middle of his kitchen, holding a mug of coffee gone cold, and realized he had stopped counting the days until he could pass responsibility to someone else. That realization made him set the mug down harder than necessary. The knock came just after sunset. Caleb opened the door to find Eleanor Price in the hallway, wearing a dark wool coat, black gloves, and an expression arranged for duty. Her silver hair was pinned tight again. A cream envelope rested in her hand. Behind her, the corridor lights hummed, and somewhere downstairs, Walter Dorsey's television murmured through a closed door. Scout stepped out from behind Caleb's ankle, ears forward, body low. Benny peered from the laundry corner, one paw on the edge of the blanket, as if the world beyond the room had become too interesting and too dangerous at the same time. Eleanor looked at the puppies. Her face did something small and quick, almost a flinch. Then the manager returned. "Mr. Brooks, Harbor Row has a restricted animal policy. German Shepherds are listed under prohibited breeds because of the building's insurance agreement." Caleb did not move. "They're 6 weeks old. The policy does not distinguish by age." "They were freezing in your alley." "I know where they were." Her voice tightened on that sentence, and for a moment the air between them carried more than rules. It carried the old shame of people who had both seen a need and failed to answer fast enough. Eleanor held out the envelope. "You have 7 calendar days to remove them from the property." Caleb took the envelope, though every part of him wanted to leave it hanging between them until Eleanor's arm grew tired. "And Unit 4B?" he asked. Her eyes sharpened. "Unit 4B is sealed. The key was tied to their crate. That does not change the policy." "Does it change anything?" Eleanor's mouth pressed thin. Behind her discipline, something weary passed through her eyes. "It changes more than I can explain in a hallway." Then she turned and walked away, her steps even, her back straight, her shoulders carrying the weight of a woman who had chosen the correct action and still hated the shape of it. Caleb closed the door. Scout sprang up, grabbed the corner of the envelope in his tiny teeth, and tugged it from Caleb's hand. The paper slid across the floor in a fierce, ridiculous battle. Then he waddled after him, barking once as if offering legal support. Caleb laughed, one small sound that escaped before grief could lock the gate. Then he picked up the notice, smoothed the damp corner, and saw the line printed in bold near the center. 7 calendar days. Morning arrived with a hard blue light over Erie, the kind that made every patch of ice shine like broken glass and every breath feel borrowed. In apartment 3C, Caleb Brooks stood at the kitchen counter with a yellow legal pad, 3 phone numbers crossed out, and 2 German Shepherd puppies asleep under the table as if they had always belonged beneath his feet. 7 calendar days. The words had followed him through the night with the patience of a judge. Scout woke whenever Caleb shifted, lifting his dark masked face and scanning the room with grave suspicion. Benny slept through almost everything, belly up, one paw twitching in dreams, as round and helpless as a warm loaf left in a cold world by mistake. Caleb had placed the violation notice on the counter, but Scout had already chewed one corner into damp pulp. The damage should have annoyed him. Instead, Caleb found himself respecting the puppy's legal strategy. He called rescues until his voice went flat. The first shelter had no foster openings. The second could place the puppies on a waiting list. A German Shepherd rescue outside Buffalo answered with kindness but offered a date 2 weeks away. "If you can hold him until then, we might have a foster," the woman said. Her name was Hannah Pike, and her voice carried the soft rasp of someone who had spent too many winters speaking over barking kennels. When Caleb drove out to meet her later that morning, he found a broad-shouldered woman in her late 40s with wind-reddened cheeks, iron-gray hair braided down her back, and hands roughened by disinfectant and leash burns. Hannah was not sentimental in the easy way. She did not call every dog an angel. She looked at each kennel as if measuring what love could do against arithmetic. "They'll be safe here if we can take them," she told Caleb, guiding him past rows of barking dogs. "But safe is not the same as peaceful. We do our best. Some days our best has mud on its boots and bills in both pockets." The kennels were clean but full. A brindle hound pressed its nose through the wire. An old black lab with cloudy eyes thumped its tail once, and then seemed too tired to continue. In the intake room, a volunteer folded towels beside a stack of forms, while a phone rang unanswered. No one there was cruel. That was what made Caleb feel worse. If the world were divided cleanly into heroes and villains, decisions would be easier. But most suffering did not come from monsters. It came from full rooms, delayed calls, unpaid invoices, and tired people trying to stretch mercy past its natural size. Caleb signed nothing. He thanked Hannah, placed a donation envelope on the counter, though she protested, and drove back to Harbor Row with the radio off. By afternoon, Scout had begun barking at the hallway. It started small. Caleb opened the apartment door to carry trash downstairs, and Scout trotted to the threshold, stiff-legged, ears pitched forward. Across the hall, Unit 4B sat at the end of the corridor behind a sealed door marked with a faded paper notice. The tape across the frame had yellowed with age. A thin line of dust rested on the threshold. Scout stared at that door, as if something behind it had whispered his name. Benny came waddling after him, sniffed the air, and retreated to Caleb's boot with the wise cowardice of a creature who preferred blankets to mysteries. Scout barked once. Not at Caleb, not at the elevator. At 4B. "Leave it," Caleb said. Scout did not leave it. The green key lay on Caleb's palm that evening while he sat at the table. He had cleaned it with warm water and a toothbrush, revealing more chipped paint along the edges and a tiny number stamped beneath the scratched letters. 4B-2. A second key, maybe. A spare. A clue too small to justify obsession and too strange to ignore. He was still turning it over when someone knocked. Mark Brooks stood outside with a paper grocery bag in one hand and the expression of a man trying to look casual while knowingly trespassing on his brother's defenses. At 39, Mark was tall but less angular than Caleb, with sandy brown hair flattened by a knit cap, kind gray eyes, and a teacher's tired smile. His coat was sprinkled with chalk dust near one cuff, as if history itself followed him home from the classroom. "Before you say you've got it handled," Mark said, lifting the bag, "I brought puppy pads, chicken, and those little treats shaped like bones. Also, I brought myself, but that part was free." Caleb stared at him. "I didn't ask you to come." "No," Mark said, stepping in carefully when Benny waddled forward to inspect his shoes. "You specialize in not asking." Scout approached Mark with cautious dignity, sniffed his pant leg, then sat between him and the hallway door like a guard, deciding whether a visitor deserved citizenship. Mark crouched, broad hands open, patient enough not to reach. "That one looks like he audits people," he said. Benny, meanwhile, tried to climb into the grocery bag and nearly tipped sideways. Mark smiled. "And that one looks like he'd lose a fight with soup." Against his will, Caleb felt the room loosen. Mark noticed the violation notice, the green key, and the legal pad full of rescue numbers. He did not lecture. That irritated Caleb more than a lecture might have. Instead, Mark asked careful questions the way he probably spoke to students who pretended not to care about failing. When Caleb mentioned Ruth Whitman, Mark's face changed. "Mrs. Whitman from 4B?" he asked. "You knew her?" "She used to come to school Veterans Day assemblies. Brought cookies once. Told my students old buildings remember more than people do." Mark paused, looking toward the hall. She had a shepherd, Sadie, big, sable female, quiet unless someone came too close to Ruth. The name landed between them. Caleb pulled Ruth's old file from the copy Eleanor had reluctantly left in the lobby office trash weeks earlier, a habit of scanning discarded paper that came from a life of noticing what others missed. There were forwarding notes, an emergency contact, a nursing facility address, and, beneath them, folded veterinary receipts from Harbor View Animal Clinic. Mark smoothed one paper with his hand. "Sadie Whitman," he read. "Adult female German shepherd. Vaccines, arthritis check, pregnancy screening." He looked up slowly. "Caleb?" "I see it." "No, you don't. You see a problem and immediately start building a perimeter around it. These puppies may not just be strays." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And you see a feeling and start calling it a plan." Mark's face hardened, but only a little. He had a gentler temper than Caleb, but gentleness was not the same as weakness. "You rescue puppies easier than you return a decent phone call," he said quietly. "Maybe because puppies don't ask why you disappeared after Dad died." The room went still. Even Scout stopped moving. Caleb looked away first, toward the window where winter pressed its pale face against the glass. Their father's death sat between the brothers like a chair no one used but no one removed. Caleb had handled the funeral arrangements, the bank paperwork, the house sale, every practical thing. Mark had handled their mother's crying. Caleb had called that softness. Mark had called it family. Neither had forgiven the other for being what the moment required. That night, after Mark left with a promise to search nursing home records and old clinic contacts, Caleb carried the green key downstairs and knocked on Eleanor Price's office door. She opened it wearing a gray cardigan over her blouse, her silver hair looser than usual, her face drawn by the kind of fatigue rules could not repair. Caleb held up the key. "I need to see inside 4B. Eleanor's expression closed. "No." "There may be a connection to Ruth Whitman's dog." "I said no. Scout keeps barking at the door." "Dogs bark." "Not like that." For a moment, something like fear crossed Eleanor's pale eyes. Then it vanished beneath management, policy, and old guilt. "Unit 4B is sealed until the family authorizes access. I will not open it because a puppy is restless and you are impatient." Caleb stood in the hallway, key in hand, anger cooling into something sharper. "You know more than you're saying." Eleanor's voice dropped. "And you know less than you think." She shut the office door. Caleb turned away, ready to climb the stairs back to 3C. At the far end of the hallway, the sealed door of Unit 4B sat under the weak yellow light. For a second, Harbor Row held its breath. Then, from behind that locked door, came a sound so faint Caleb almost missed it. A slow, dry scratch against wood, like claws dragging once across the floor. By the fifth night, Harbor Row had become a building of small sounds. Pipes knocked behind plaster walls. Wind worried the old window frames. Somewhere below, Mr. Dorsey's television faded in and out like a tired preacher speaking through snow. In apartment 3C, Caleb Brooks sat at the kitchen table with the green key beside his coffee mug, and the violation notice folded into a square too neat to be accidental. Benny slept inside the open crate, belly pressed into the fleece blanket, one paw twitching as if chasing something warmer than memory. Scout lay by the door, not asleep, not fully awake, his dark ears lifting whenever the hallway made the faintest creak. Caleb had spent the evening pretending to make plans. Rescue calls, foster options, notes from Mark. A phone number for Ruth Whitman's nursing facility written in Mark's slanted teacher handwriting. But every plan seemed to end at the same locked door, Unit 4B. The scratch Caleb had heard the night before still moved around in his mind like a match struck in a dark room. Eleanor had refused to open the apartment. Legally, perhaps she was right. Caleb hated that. He hated it more because in her place he might have done the same thing years ago. Follow the rule, protect the perimeter. Let the unknown remain unknown if knowing would demand too much. Near midnight, snow began again. Not heavy at first, only a gray whisper against the glass. But the lake wind soon drove it sideways until the windows looked rubbed with ash. Caleb finally turned off the kitchen light and lay down on the couch instead of the bed. He told himself it was because the puppies might need him. The truth was less tidy. The bedroom felt too far from the door. He must have slept, because the next thing he knew, Scout was barking. Not the sharp little protest he gave the vacuum cleaner, not the uncertain woof he aimed at his own reflection in the dark patio glass. This bark came from deep in his small chest, raw and urgent, as if the puppy had heard something older than fear. Caleb sat up at once. The clock on the microwave glowed 2:13 a.m. Scout! Scout did not stop. He stood at the apartment door, body rigid, paws braced, ears forward, tail low. Benny was awake now, too, whining from the crate, his small face pressed against the wire. Caleb crossed the room barefoot, cold floor biting the soles of his feet. "Easy," he whispered, though nothing in the apartment felt easy. Scout scratched once at the door, then barked again, louder. Caleb opened it before he had fully decided to. The hallway was dim, lit by 2 yellow bulbs that made the old wallpaper look sicker than it was. Snow hissed against the stairwell windows. At the far end of the corridor, below the turn toward Eleanor Price's apartment, a thin line of light showed under her door. Scout bolted. For a creature who had been half frozen in an alley days earlier, he moved with astonishing purpose, slipping once on the hallway runner, recovering, then racing toward Eleanor's door. Caleb followed, grabbing his jacket from the hook as he went. Benny's whine rose behind him, small and frightened. But Caleb could not turn back. Scout reached Eleanor's door and began clawing at the wood, barking between frantic scrapes. Caleb knocked hard. "Mrs. Price?" No answer. He knocked again, louder. "Eleanor!" Inside, something shifted, a faint thump, then a sound like a chair leg dragging across tile. Caleb's training returned in pieces. Listen, assess, act. He tried the knob. Locked. He called her name again. Silence answered, except for Scout's claws against the lower panel. Caleb stepped back once, measured the frame, and drove his shoulder into the door. Pain flashed through him. The old wood groaned but held. He hit it again. On the third strike, the lock plate tore loose and the door swung inward. Eleanor's apartment smelled of chamomile tea, old paper, and the faint medicinal sharpness of a pill bottle left open too long. The front room was immaculate. Narrow sofa, lace runner, framed photograph of Harold Price in a fishing vest, his round face smiling from another lifetime. In the kitchen, Eleanor lay on the floor beside a fallen chair. She was conscious, but her face had gone pale beneath the kitchen light, and one hand trembled as it reached toward a phone lying under the table. Her gray cardigan was twisted at one shoulder. A small orange prescription bottle rested near the cabinet. Caleb moved to her side without touching her too quickly. "Eleanor, it's Caleb. Can you hear me?" Her eyes found his, frightened and furious at once, as if even helplessness had offended her standards. "Phone," she whispered, the word thin and broken by pain. "I've got it." Caleb pulled his own phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher who answered was a calm woman with a low, steady voice, the kind of voice trained to keep panic from spreading through a room. Caleb gave the address, the apartment number, Eleanor's condition, the possible medication reaction, the fall. He kept his tone controlled, but his bare feet were numb on the kitchen tile, and Scout had gone silent beside him, pressed low to the floor near Eleanor's shoes. While they waited, Caleb kept Eleanor talking. Simple questions: name, day, pain, breathing. She answered some, missed others, grew angry when she could not make her body obey. That anger hurt to watch. It was not pride exactly. It was the terror of a woman who had built her life around control, discovering that control could vanish between one breath and the next. The paramedics arrived with a burst of cold air and red light flashing through the blinds. The lead medic, Marcus Hill, was a tall black man in his early 40s with close-cropped hair, a square jaw, and a voice both firm and kind. He moved with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that frightened people listen better to steadiness than speed. His partner, Jill Monroe, was a compact woman with freckled skin, sharp green eyes, and auburn hair tucked under a navy knit cap. She spoke gently to Eleanor while checking her vitals, calling her ma'am in a way that sounded respectful rather than distant. They loaded Eleanor onto a stretcher. As Marcus asked Caleb about the timeline, his eyes flicked to Scout. "Puppy found her?" he asked. "He heard something," Caleb said. Marcus nodded once. "Good ears." After they carried Eleanor out, Caleb remained in the apartment to pull the broken door mostly closed. That was when he saw the papers spread across the kitchen table. Harbor Row sale documents, letters to the owner, printed petitions, notes in Eleanor's tight handwriting, senior tenants, rent increase risk, veteran housing concern, Whitman file unresolved. Beside the stack sat an old photograph. Ruth Whitman stood in the courtyard years earlier, small and smiling in a blue cardigan, one hand resting on the head of a sable German shepherd with amber eyes. Sadie. Not a rumor, not a loose end, a life. For the first time, Caleb saw Eleanor not as the woman who wanted the puppies gone, but as someone standing alone in a collapsing doorway, trying to hold back a storm with forms, rules, and a spine that refused to bend. He stepped back into the hallway. Snow tapped against the windows. Scout sat in the middle of the corridor, shaking now, all the fierce purpose gone from his little body. Caleb knelt beside him and placed one hand gently along his back. For once, he did not say temporary. He only whispered, "Good job." Eleanor Price came back to Harbor Row the next afternoon, pale beneath a wool scarf the color of old oatmeal, and moving more slowly than the building had ever seen her move. The snow had thinned into a gray mist, leaving the sidewalk slick and shining, and every tenant who watched through a curtain pretended not to be watching. Eleanor hated that most of all. She had spent 11 years being the woman who noticed everyone else's loose railing, overdue rent, dripping faucet, and unshoveled step. Now she was the one being noticed. Her silver hair was pinned, but not tightly. Her dark coat hung a little unevenly over one shoulder. In her left hand, she carried no clipboard, no folder, no printed notice. Only a knitted scarf Harold had bought her years ago from a church craft table, back when she still believed handmade things could not outlive the hands that gave them. Caleb opened his door before she knocked twice. He looked tired, his beard rougher than usual, his eyes watchful but not unkind. Behind his boot, Scout lifted his head. Benny remained half asleep on the fleece blanket, one ear folded backward, too committed to his nap to greet history as it arrived. "I came to say thank you," Eleanor said. Caleb stepped aside. "You should thank Scout." The words left a space between them, not a warm space, not yet. Eleanor looked down at the little German shepherd who had barked until a door broke open. Scout did not run to her. He did not wag his tail like forgiveness was cheap. He simply watched her, dark eyes steady, as if deciding whether people could learn anything after making themselves so difficult. Eleanor sat at the edge of Caleb's kitchen chair. Caleb remained standing for a moment, then took the chair across from her. Neither spoke. The silence was uncomfortable enough to feel honest. Outside, a car passed through slush. The radiator clicked. Benny made a tiny, snuffling noise in his sleep, like a grandfather disapproving of soup. At last, Eleanor folded her hands. "I heard barking near 4B weeks ago," she said. "Not every night, not loud. Just enough." Her mouth tightened. "I told myself it was from the alley, or from the street, or that I was tired." She looked toward the hallway, though the closed apartment door blocked the view. "The truth is, I was afraid to open that door." Caleb did not interrupt. "If there was something wrong inside, then I would have to answer for why I had not found it sooner." "If there was nothing wrong, I would still have broken a seal I had no legal right to break. Either way, there would be a report, a call, a complaint, a reason for the owner to say, 'I could no longer manage this building.'" Her voice thinned, but did not break. "After Harold died, responsibility was the only thing that kept me upright. Then one day it stopped being a spine and became a cage." Caleb understood more than he wanted to. He had used duty the same way. A clean word for a locked door, a noble name for hiding. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. Mark's name lit the screen. Caleb put it on speaker because Eleanor was already looking at him as if she expected the call to matter. Mark's voice came through low and careful. "I found Ruth Whitman." Eleanor closed her eyes. Mark explained that Ruth was living at Lakeview Memory Care outside Ashtabula, a modest facility with blue shutters and bird feeders outside nearly every window. He had spoken with a nurse named Amy Lowell, a broad-faced woman in her mid-50s with kind hazel eyes, cropped blonde hair, and the soft, durable patience of someone who had learned that memory did not move in straight lines. Amy remembered Ruth because Ruth still folded napkins for the dog's supper every evening, though no dog came. "She doesn't remember Harbor Row clearly," Mark said, "but she remembered Sadie." Eleanor's hands tightened. "She cried when I said the name," Mark continued. "Not loud, just like the name opened a room inside her. She said Sadie had 2 little ones. She said she tied the green key to the crate so whoever found them would bring them back to 4B. She kept saying, 'They know the door. Sadie knows the door.'" Caleb looked down at Scout. The puppy's ears had lifted. Mark's voice grew heavier. "Ruth also said a man came to help clear things before the inspection. She couldn't remember who. Maybe family. Maybe someone from the owner's side. She thought he moved the crate because dogs would make trouble. She kept asking whether the babies were cold." No one spoke for several seconds. Eleanor stood so abruptly the chair legs scraped. "I have the master key." Caleb rose too. "You said you couldn't open it." "I said I wouldn't." She looked older than before, but also clearer. "There is a difference." Mark arrived 20 minutes later, cheeks red from the cold, his teacher's satchel still slung over one shoulder. He greeted Eleanor politely, though his eyes measured the hallway, the sealed tape, the door of 4B, and the puppy pressed against Caleb's leg. Benny was left safely inside Caleb's apartment, with the crate door open and a bowl of water nearby. Scout came with them, carried in Caleb's arms until they reached the end of the corridor. The little dog trembled, but his gaze stayed fixed on 4B. Eleanor broke the old seal with a sound like paper surrendering. Her hand shook once before the key entered the lock. When the door opened, stale air breathed out into the hallway. Dust, cold wood, something faintly animal beneath it. Unit 4B was dim and undisturbed in the front room. A faded blue cardigan hung over the back of a chair. A porcelain angel stood on the windowsill, one wing chipped. There were stacks of unopened mail, a calendar still turned to last spring, and a dog bowl under the kitchen table, empty but clean. Eleanor pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, then lowered it quickly, ashamed of needing the gesture. Scout gave a small whine. They followed him to the rear storage room. There, behind boxes labeled Christmas linens and Ruth, kitchen, they found a nest made from towels, old sweaters, and strips of blanket, pulled into a corner near the heating vent. Sable fur clung to the fabric. More fur marked the baseboard. On the wooden floor, faint claw marks dragged toward the back window, where a loose latch had left a narrow gap open to the fire escape. Sadie was not there. Caleb crouched beside the nest and touched one strand of sable fur caught on a nail. Eleanor stood behind him, very still. Mark exhaled slowly. Outside the cracked window, snow blew across the iron steps. "She got out," Caleb said. Eleanor looked at the empty nest, the open gap, and the place where a mother dog had waited until waiting was no longer enough. "Yes," she whispered. "And she may still be trying to come back." Winter did not loosen its grip all at once. It stayed over Erie in patches of hard snow beneath parked cars, in gray ridges along the curbs, in the lake wind that found every gap between brick and bone. For 3 days after Unit 4B was opened, Harbor Row changed from an old apartment building into a search party with bad knees, borrowed flashlights, and more determination than organization. Caleb Brooks, Mark, Eleanor Price, and a handful of residents moved through the alleys near the lake, checked behind garages, under loading docks, beside frozen dumpsters, and around the storage sheds at the edge of the property. No one called it hope at first. Hope sounded too delicate, too likely to break if spoken aloud. They called it looking. Walter Dorsey from 2A came with a thermos of coffee and a walking stick, insisting that 81 years had not made him useless, only slower and better at noticing low places. Lena Ortiz from 1B joined after work, a short, broad-hipped widow in her early 70s with thick white hair, copper skin, and a laugh that could warm a stairwell. She had once raised 3 sons in 2 bedrooms and trusted neither developers nor men who wore shoes too shiny for winter. She carried a bag of dog treats in one pocket and cough drops in the other, offering both with the same authority. Even Mr. Paul Hennessy from the 3rd floor, a thin, retired postal clerk with a bent nose, watery blue eyes, and the suspicious temperament of a man who had spent 40 years reading names on envelopes, came outside to check the old mail shed. "Dogs know roots," he said. "People forget that. Dogs remember where sorrow turns left." Benny and Scout were kept safe in the crate when the group searched outdoors. Dr. Benton had warned Caleb not to expose them too long to the cold, but their scent mattered. Caleb placed the crate near the rear door of Harbor Row during the searches, wrapped on 3 sides with blankets so the puppies could smell and be smelled without being frightened. Benny usually curled into a ball and slept through the grand operations of mankind. Scout remained alert, nose lifted, eyes fixed on the wind as if reading a letter no one else could see. Sadie did not appear that first day, nor the second. On the 3rd, they found tracks behind the abandoned laundromat 2 blocks away. Too large for a fox, too narrow for a stray mastiff someone had mentioned. Sable fur clung to a broken board near the alley fence. Caleb crouched over it, touching nothing at first. He had learned long ago that evidence had a dignity of its own. Mark stood beside him, hands tucked into his coat pockets, quiet for once. The silence between the brothers had changed. It no longer had teeth. "You think she's circling back?" Mark asked. Caleb looked toward Harbor Row, where the brick building rose against the cloudy sky like an old ship refusing to sink. A mother doesn't leave the last place her babies were, unless she has to. Mark nodded. You always say things like that and pretend you're not sentimental. Teacher talk made you soft. Maybe, but soft people get summer break. Caleb gave him a sideways look. It was not quite forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door left unlatched. While they searched, Eleanor fought a different battle. She moved through Harbor Row with a cane in one hand and petition papers in the other, visiting tenants she had once addressed mostly through notices. Her face remained pale from the hospital, but her voice had grown steadier. She explained the pending sale, the likely rent increases, the risk to elderly tenants and veterans on fixed incomes. She did not decorate the truth. Eleanor had never been good at decoration, but she had become very good at saying, "I was wrong to keep this to myself." That sentence, repeated in doorways and kitchens, carried more weight than any apology she could have printed. By the fourth evening, nearly every tenant had signed. Walter signed with slow, careful letters. Lena signed hard enough to nearly tear the page. Paul Hennessy read the entire petition twice before signing, then asked for a copy because a paper without a copy is just a rumor in a nice coat. Eleanor almost smiled. Sadie came back near dawn on the fifth day. Caleb saw her first from the service hallway window, a lean, sable German shepherd standing near the rear entrance where the alley bent toward the old fire escape. She was about 5 years old, with a thick but dirty coat, amber eyes, ribs faint beneath fur, and one ear nicked at the edge. She did not look noble in the polished way of posters or training manuals. She looked tired, wary, and magnificently unwilling to surrender. Snow dusted her muzzle. Her head was lowered, but her gaze never left the blanket-wrapped crate by the door. Caleb did not rush. He opened the service door and sat down on the cold step, leaving space between himself, the crate, and the dog. Mark came to the stairwell but stayed back. Eleanor stood behind him, wrapped in Harold's scarf, holding the green key in her gloved hand. Inside the crate, Scout whined. Benny woke and made a small, confused sound. Sadie's body tightened. Her ears shifted forward. One paw lifted, then settled back into the snow. No one spoke. That was the strange holiness of the moment. Not grand, not clean. Just an old building, a cold alley, a mother dog deciding whether the world could be trusted with the one thing it had already failed once. Eleanor moved slowly. She stepped down, bent with effort, and placed the green key on the snow between Sadie and the rear door. "Ruth wanted you to know the way back," she whispered. Sadie stared at the key. Then she lowered her head and sniffed it. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then she took one step toward the crate. Scout pressed his nose to the wire. Benny tumbled forward, awake now, tail making small, uncertain beats against the blanket. Caleb remained seated, hands open on his knees. He did not conquer her. He did not claim her trust. He only let the distance be hers to cross. Sadie came another step, then another. When she reached the crate, she touched her nose to Scout first, then Benny, and a sound came from her chest that was not a bark or a whine, but something older, almost like a broken prayer finding its way home. Hannah Pike's rescue took Sadie in that afternoon for medical care, promising foster placement that would keep the family connected until the puppies were old enough. Sadie allowed Caleb to lift the crate only after watching him for a long time, as if signing a treaty no human document could hold. Weeks later, after training, vet checks, and more paperwork than Caleb believed any creature under 20 pounds should require, Scout stayed with him. Benny went to Mark, who arrived with a proper bed, 3 toys, and the smug expression of a man already defeated by love. "Little traitor picked the teacher," Caleb said, scratching Benny under the chin. "Probably for summer vacation." Harbor Row did not become paradise. The roof still leaked near the north stairwell. The radiator still clanked like an old knight in bad armor. But Eleanor's petition delayed the sale and forced a tenant review meeting. More importantly, she pushed through a supervised rescue pet exemption policy with training, insurance documentation, and strict safety rules. It was not perfect. Good things rarely arrive wearing polished shoes, but it was a beginning. On a late winter morning, Caleb walked through the old alley alone, with Scout trotting beside him, larger now, steadier, still watching every corner as if the world remained a puzzle worth solving. The gray crate was gone. The red arrow still pointed at the service door. The bricks were still scarred by weather. But Unit 4B was open for repairs, sunlight falling through its rear window onto swept floors and stacked tools. On Caleb's key ring, the little green key clicked softly against his apartment key. It no longer opened a forgotten room. It reminded him that some doors stay closed not because nothing waits behind them, but because someone has not yet become brave enough to hear the faint scratching on the other side. What stays with me is not only that 2 puppies were found in the snow, or that Scout barked at exactly the right moment. It is the way God sometimes works through the smallest sounds we almost ignore. A scratch behind a closed door. A puppy crying in an alley. A neighbor we judged too quickly. Caleb thought he was only saving 2 helpless animals, but in truth, God was opening doors inside him, too. Eleanor had spent years protecting rules because rules felt safer than being wrong. Many of us do the same. We lock away guilt, grief, fear, and call it responsibility. But mercy has a quiet way of finding the key. Maybe the miracle was not loud. Maybe it was simply this: people finally stopped walking past what needed love. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that no one is too forgotten for grace. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories like this. May God bless you, protect your home, and place kindness on your path tonight.